You made it. Here. Finally. Checked out of office to check into the sweet views of that place you've always wanted to go. You know the one. It's nice. Even the kids like it.
This place is so cool.
And they never like it.
Mom, can we go to the pool?
Look at that. Not even asking for the Wi-Fi. When you're with Amex, it's not if it's going to happen, but when. American Express. Don't live life without it.
For the love of fall, Starbucks pumpkin spice lattes and pumpkin cream cold brews are back. Smooth espresso dashed with pumpkin pie spice and velvety whipped cream. Or cold brew topped with pumpkin cream cold foam fit for the season. Your pumpkin awaits. Order today in the Starbucks app.
Welcome to the Vault Podcast, classic music reviews, presented by IV Creative. Now, here's your hosts, B. Cox and the crew.
Greetings and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the Vault Podcast, classic music reviews, presented by IV Creative. It's a perspective of the classics from a fresh point of view. We appreciate you for taking your time and lending your ears to our perspective. You could be anywhere listening to anything, but you're right here with us, so we thank you. With you today is yours truly, B. Cox, and with me, I have yet another very special guest coming into the house today. We're going to get to that in just a second, but first of all, we want to give a shout out to all the fans out there stateside and worldwide for continuing to push the numbers up and for spreading the word. We can't say thank you enough to all of you out there, especially the fans out there stateside, all across the states and in North America, and of course all of our fans in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Europe, Asia, Australia. Thank you all for all of the 7 continents, well at least the 6 that are inhabited, and across all the oceans here on the world for continuing to give the Vault all the success that we've enjoyed. We definitely appreciate y'all for pushing the word out there. It's summertime out there, y'all. We want to make sure everybody's enjoying and having a safe summer, so continue to spread the word. You can visit us on our website, that's vaultclassicpod.com, vaultclassicpod.com. Go there to learn about the show, view the back episodes, go ahead and leave us a review, and make sure that you spread the word for that website and also the show out there every Monday, a new show. As we always say here on the Vault, our motto is hashtag open the vault, hashtag nothing but the classics, or MBTC. And today, as I mentioned before, we have yet another special guest here to break down another album for us here today. You heard her earlier on an episode on the Vault for a TLC review. We're welcoming back Charlee D of the Word to the Mother podcast here on the show. We decided to chop it up once again, and here's how the conversation went. And joining us here once again in the Vault, we'd like to welcome her back to the show once again. You know, y'all, once you come to the show, you're not just a friend of the show, you're family of the show. And we've had a few people stop by who we consider family, and we're considering her family now. You heard her on our review earlier this year for TLC's Ooh on the TLC Tip as it turned 30. You know, she was a TLC super fan, still is a TLC super fan, and she has a super dope podcast, as we mentioned in our intro, Word to the Mother podcast. Y'all make sure y'all check that out on wherever you can find podcasts out there. It's a retrospective podcast on hip-hop and R&B in the 1990s. And of course, you know, we love that here at the Vault Classic Music Reviews podcast. So we'd like to welcome back to the show our family, none other than the incomparable Charlee D of the Word to the Mother podcast. Charlee, how's it going?
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. It's going well.
Good.
I'm excited to be back and talking about another soundtrack or album that I absolutely love and have lots to share on it. So
Absolutely.
I'm excited to be back.
Yeah, well, we're glad to have you back. Like I said, the episode that we did with TLC, I remember one of my friends talked to me and said, it sounded like y'all were having a ball on there. I was like, well, we were.
Yes,
you know,
we were.
That wasn't scripted. That was just a really raw energy. We talk about finding your people. When you find your people, especially in the podcasting space, and y'all click on a level, that's the type of energy that you get. So we're glad to have you back.
Exactly.
So today's topic, and I like to talk about this. Now, earlier this year, Charlee, we did a review of the movie Juice that turned 30 earlier this year in January.
Everybody turned 30.
Yeah. So that was the movie, obviously, you know, with Tupac Shakur, Omar Epps, Khalil Kain, Jermaine Hopkins, Samuel L. Jackson, just to name a few people, Cindy Heron, Queen Latifah, Flex, all these different other hip hop personalities. And we didn't talk so much about the soundtrack. We talked more about the movie because the movie was a cultural force. Well, we're going to cover another soundtrack in particular, but we're going to talk a little bit about the movie as well. And for those who were out and around during this time, this was really the era where we felt like the movies, particularly in black culture, I felt like though the movie and the soundtracks really complemented each other well. And so we have one that does just that today. So we're going to go back 30 years ago, and we're going to go back to June 30th, 1992, and we're going to go back and look at the soundtrack of the movie Boomerang. Yes, the movie Boomerang, starring none other than one of the, as I like to call him, one of the kings of comedy, true kings of comedy, Eddie Murphy. And this was a period in a time where Eddie Murphy, starting out in the mid to late 80s into the 90s, everything that he was doing was absolute gold. And so capitalizing on this period, he was starring in this movie Boomerang, directed by Reginald Hudlin, on a screenplay by Barry Blaustein and David Sheffield. This starred Eddie Murphy along with two very fine ladies and wonderful actresses, the incomparable Academy Award-winning Halle Berry, and then also the incomparable Robin Givens. Also co-starring David Alan Grier, a very early role as well for Martin Lawrence, before right around the same time, I would say, when he was getting ready to start his television show. It also had guest appearances and starring roles and co-starring roles by the likes of Grace Jones, who also was on the soundtrack, by the late, great, legendary Eartha Kitt, Chris Rock, Tisha Campbell, Layla Rashawn, and the late, great Pops, John Witherspoon.
Yes. Yes.
And so we talk about these films, Charlie, and now we're going to get into the soundtrack. We're really here to cover the soundtrack, but you cannot talk about the soundtrack without first talking a little bit about the film. And we talk about there are certain films inside of the black culture when we go back and talk about these films back in the day that are cultural forces and that really become like cult classics, but then eventually ascend above the cult status and become really cultural phenomenons. Boomerang was a cultural phenomenon. I mean, it was a really, really big movie because of the people that it starred. Eddie Murphy was a huge star back then, just off the break. But then when you bring in talents like John Witherspoon and people like Martin Lawrence and David Alan Grier and Eartha Kitt and Tisha Campbell and Layla Rashawn, and then you bring in Halle Berry and Robin Givens, it's like it was a no-brainer for a lot of us. So we'll go into a little bit about the movie. Now, I do have to ask you, this movie, when it came, did you see this movie when it came out back then?
I saw this movie in the theater, and I have to emphasize that because I did not go to the theater that much. So I almost remember, between the 80s and the 90s, I pretty much remember every movie I actually saw in the theater because it was rare. Okay. But this one I actually saw in the theater, and the crazy part was I saw it with my mama. Oh, wow. I don't know how that happened, but it was super embarrassing. But it was very, very memorable. I remember sitting there going, oh my goodness, we going here with this, some of these scenes. But I did. I saw it in the theater.
Now, I was 10 when this movie came out. And so I wasn't going to see this movie. First of all, my parents weren't letting me go to the movies with my sister to go see this. And so I think the first time that I saw it was actually over a homeboy's house when when this folks rented it from Blockbuster. Another throwback and relic of the past, Blockbuster. And so I went and I saw it, and I was even young enough at that point to see it. But I mean, at that point in years, I was watching stuff I probably had no business watching. But you know, that was the 90s. You know what I'm saying? Like
that's how we did it.
We did a lot of things that we weren't supposed to do back in the day. I mean, but this movie, just to give you an idea, and for those of you who haven't seen the movie, I want to tell you to go and watch it ASAP because I think it's something that if you're into black culture, you have to watch this movie. It's definitely an essential film in the 90s. It stars, as we said, Eddie Murphy, who is a big-time ad exec at a company, at a cosmetics company.
Marcus, darling.
Yeah, Marcus Graham. So not only is he a big-time exec, but he's a player. You know, the movie said that describes him as a womanizer and a chauvinist, but he's a player, for real. He's a player from the Himalayas, as they like to say on Martin, ironically enough. You know, but, you know, so Marcus is, you know, big time ad exec. His company gets bought out, and then he thinks that he's going to have the top job as far as advertising is concerned, but instead loses it to a female counterpart, Jacqueline. Jacqueline, played by Robin Givens. Now, Jacqueline, of course, he's enamored with her, thinking that he can sort of sleep his way into being able to get into good favor, except for Marcus doesn't understand that he's dealing with the mirror image of himself. That's exactly who Jacqueline is. She is Marcus in female form.
Yes.
She pretty much kind of strings him along. She knows that Marcus is into her, but kind of doesn't really pay him any mind. So he's enamored with Jacqueline, attempting to be able to get into her good graces. Now, also take the other part of this triangle in this movie is Angela, who is a colleague of Marcus's, played none other by Halle Berry. Angela, who Marcus attempts to set up with his friend Gerard, but they don't end up hitting it off. They just end up pretty much staying friends. Most of the movie is Marcus attempting to woo Jacqueline, him not paying him any mind, ignoring him, basically doing what Marcus does to women all the time.
Yep.
Eventually, she does give him some, and they do sleep together. And another thing about this movie, there's a thing about feet in this movie that Marcus is very particular about feet.
He introduces the hammer toes. I mean, look, I'm not going to cut you off because I'm going to let you finish. But there's so many cultural references that came out of this movie. I think people forget at that time. We were repeating and quoting these things on and on. But even today, I mean, some of these things are still staying in our vernacular. After that, men was paying attention to toes and hammer toes and feet. That started with that movie.
Yes.
Nobody cared about feet for them.
Yeah. So then, Marcus attempts to get to Jacqueline. Then eventually, what happens in what Marcus does to women, he finds himself in a situation. He begins to fall for Jacqueline, but then she basically is just like, you know what? We just gonna keep this with sex, and it's my rules, my way or the highway. And then what happens is that, like I said, the roles are reversed. Hence the title of this movie, Boomerang, okay? Everybody knowing a boomerang is a tool that you throw out and then eventually it comes right back at you, which is exactly what's happening to Marcus. The whole time this is happening, though, Marcus eventually wants more with Jacqueline. She ends the affair, and then she basically leverages her power and stuff over him. Again, part of the thing what happens to Marcus. Now, Marcus eventually ends up spending time with Angela, and they begin to fall for each other, and then they have sex. So then, now, Marcus and Angela are sort of together, but not really together, and then he also tends to downplay it when he's talking to other people, specifically when he's talking to Jacqueline, and then Jacqueline and Marcus end up sleeping together. So then eventually, this messes things up with Angela. Marcus decides that he actually has feelings for Angela. She's the one that he wants, and then, bam, they end up all together and they live happily ever after. Boom. That's a 5-minute synopsis of what the movie is about, but you have to watch it because the movie is great. And like Charlie said, the cultural references from this movie are ridiculous.
Oh my gosh.
Just talking about Eartha Kitt. Eartha Kitt in this was absolutely hilarious. I'm not wearing any panties. And then Pops, John Witherspoon playing Gerard's father.
You gotta coordinate. I mean, we still. Oh my goodness.
Absolutely.
He was iconic in that movie.
He was, man. It really, and so this movie actually did really, really well. Had a budget of $42 million. Had a box office of $131 million, which made it a huge success. And it's a movie that even years afterwards in our culture, when it came to rom-coms, definitely became one of the standards as far as black rom-coms were concerned. So, it was a great, great movie. So, of course, in those times when you had a great black movie, you needed a good soundtrack. And if nothing else, what the 90s did when we delivered on great cultural movies, we also had great soundtracks. So here was another one that we had today. Now, the soundtrack of Boomerang came out the day before the movie came out, and it was recorded between March and May of 1992. It was recorded on LaFace Records, and a runtime of 55 minutes, 24 seconds. The executive producers on there, none other than Face and Reid.
Of course.
Babyface and L.A. Reid. Other producers on this as well, Dallas Austin, Shivani and Buster, Tribe Called Quest, Kenny Vaughn, and PM Dawn. Now, some of the people here on this album, just to talk about some of the guest appearances, of course, Babyface was a artist on this. You also had a song by Johnny Gill. You had a song by PM Dawn. We'll get into that in just a second. A song by Boyz II Men. We'll get into that in a second. But really, most famously, this soundtrack kind of served to everybody's introduction to Toni Braxton.
I know. Yes, I was looking at the lineup of the soundtrack earlier, and I saw the poster, and I noticed all the way at the bottom it says introducing Toni Braxton, and it's just so crazy to see that and know that. I believe the first single from this might have been her first or second single out, and to think of what she's become after that. But like this introduced the world to Toni. It's like, wow,
it did. It really served as a springboard for her career, and then what would happen afterwards would really take her into the stratosphere where she would become a superstar, an R&B superstar. But then you also had appearances by Keith Washington, also by Aaron Hall and Charlie Wilson, and then Grace Jones, who served as the face of the cosmetics company, also had a song on here as well. And then just to close it out, songs by Tribe Called Quest, Shanice, and Kenny Vaughn, and The Art of Love. So 5 singles, actually 6 singles for Boomerang. The first one, Give You My Heart, with Babyface and Toni Braxton, released June 15th, 1992. End of the Road by Boyz II Men, released July 14th, 1992. And we'll get into just how epic this song was when it came out.
epic.
I Die Without You by PM Dawn. Again, another epic song. Love Should Have Brought You Home by Toni Braxton, released December 4th, 1992. 7-Day Weekend by Grace Jones and later on in the year, and then Hot Sex on a Platter by Tribe Called Quest, released late in the year, heading really into 1993. So we're going to go ahead and get into it.
Yes.
First thoughts and reflections.
So Charlie, we're going to get your perspective on the soundtrack for Boomerang. Just give us an idea what you thought about it when you first heard that soundtrack, when it's accompanied with the film. Give us your thoughts on what you thought about the music, how you thought it correlated with the movie, and then since then, what's your thoughts about the soundtrack now that it's been 30 years later?
Well, first I got to go back to the movie since they're so closely tied together and say that, I did my own episode on this for my own podcast. And it was when I started out the podcast, I made a list of all the things I wanted to do. And in that initial list, the Boomerang soundtrack was already something I knew I wanted to do because I remember in the 90s and at that time, it was a huge soundtrack, and almost every song that came off of that was so memorable and had really huge hits. I mean, you had Toni and you had PM Dawn and you had Boyz II Men, but it was a really big soundtrack. I ended up rewatching this movie, I would say in the last 5 years or so, because I loved it in the 90s. I mentioned I saw it with my mom, which was interesting and a little bit cringy, but I loved it. I have to say really quickly, what I loved about that movie and why it ended up being so memorable for me is because when that movie came out in 92, I was about 14-ish. It was the first time I saw a movie that one was all black, but two, I mean, I already had Coming to America. That still stands as my number one favorite black comedy.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I would put this as number 2 for Eddie Murphy. But what really stood out to me from this is that not only was it all black, but everybody in the movie, maybe with the exception of Boney T, was an upwardly mobile, educated, high-paid, professional, successful. The movie was just dripping black success.
And excellence.
I mean, you had Marcus and Jack, and they live in these gorgeous penthouses. They're wearing these beautiful clothes. They're in the gym. They're at these restaurants. I mean, even when you see people pass, they look like they live in a beautiful area. The whole movie just came off as so beautiful and so accomplished and so aspirational. I will never forget when the movie first started, and I will get into that first song when the title comes in. I believe that the artist's name is Marcus Miller, because I was just so impressed with it. It just rolled up so smooth and so cool. I remember thinking like, ooh, this looks like it's gonna be good. Like it just gave me goosebumps. Like this is just, it was like a whole different world than what I was seeing and what I normally see on TV. You don't normally see a movie that's just full of professional, middle class, upwardly middle class, well-to-do black people. I remember Leela Rashawn walking down the street with this gorgeous outfit with this cream and this coat and the boots and all the girls I remember after, oh my God, I love this, I love that. They all look so successful. And it, like I mentioned the word aspirational, it's just like, this is a world where we're all doing wonderful. And that really, really stuck with it for me. And everybody in there, they got these great jobs and they're doing these great things and have these big positions. it really like stuck with me. So then when the soundtrack came out, and I believe the soundtrack came out the same time, I think the Toni Braxton single came out either a little bit before to give us a taste or around that time. I don't recall, but it was an instant hit.
Yes.
You know, love should have brought, I want to call it love should have brought your ass home last night, sticking my finger in somebody's forehead, because it's the same thing. I can't say the title without seeing Angela with her finger, and the video used to start that way. But, you know, the soundtrack came out and it was synonymous with the movie. And the movie was it was one of those movies when it hit, everybody was talking about it.
Yeah.
For weeks and in months, everybody was laughing about, quoting about, joking, referencing this movie.
Yes.
And so when the videos came out, Love Should Have Brought You Home Last Night, End of the Road, PM Dawn, they would show clips of it. The movie was great, but it wasn't just that it was great. The thing that I still like about it is the themes in the movie, they still hold up well today in 2022. Yes. You can still relate to the man who's a dog that doesn't respect women and everything, and the little things that they're saying in there. This movie was the first movie that introduced me to the racial. It's racial. Remember that conversation that Martin Lawrence was having? He's talking about the asparagus spears versus asparagus tips. It's racial. Like, they brought up stuff that I was the first time I heard it, and it still applies today. So when the music came out, like, I'm in every video. I'm taking all this very seriously. Most of these songs that came out came big hits. End of the Road ended up being a huge hit. I think I did do an episode on them. I think that was one of their biggest hits. And it was a huge introduction to Toni. So I was just all into the whole Boomerang world, the movie and the soundtrack. The other thing that I really loved about this movie and the soundtrack, and this is not necessarily on the soundtrack, but the movie introduced me to a couple compositions from, I would say, the score, because they're not actually on the soundtrack, but I was like super impressed by the music that they selected in here. It's a movie that has a lot of music. Yeah. And that's something that I naturally gravitate towards as a audiophile, I guess. But there were 3 different selections in the movie that I'd never heard before, and they're not actually in the soundtrack, but I was like, whoa, what is that? And at that time, this is prior to the internet for some people, there was no way to really look those up. I was impressed by the messages of the movie, and also the feel and the tone, and just the R&B. It was just a hot soundtrack. Like, everything was rocking. But there was also some things in there that weren't 90s and R&B, and I was like, whoa, what is that? Including that intro song by Marcus Miller. I think it's called Boomerang. It was just so jazzy and so smooth, and it just made me feel like, wow, this is a successful, wonderful, beautiful Black world. You know,
indeed.
Loved it. Yes. And still to this day.
And you know, it's to say something about, like you mentioned, seeing these upperly mobile, upper middle class Black people at a successful company, successful Black owned company, Black faces of the
Everybody
company,
is
and
Black.
then to be able to see them be successful, to live in nice houses and to have nice things and to be successful. It really was at a point when we were talking about the contrast to how some films in the early 90s, the way that they were, like on the backdrop of movies like Boys in the Hood and Juice and Menace to Society and Fresh and The Shield, where you saw the other aspect of Black life that many people glorify, but isn't necessarily to be desired. But this was something that was completely different. Now, I will also say with this, in particular with the movie and then also the soundtrack, this was really one of the things that what I loved about soundtracks in the 90s, in particular about these Black films, is that the music, particularly the songs and the imagery of the songs when you had the videos, and then also the themes of the songs, actually mirrored what was going on in the movie. So when you have songs like Give You My Heart and Love Should Have Brought You Home, or in your case, Charlie, Love Should Have Brought Your Ass Home Last Night, there you go. Don't Want to Love You, End of the Road, I Die Without You. So these are like when the soundtracks were so closely tied to the themes of the movie.
Reversal of a Dog.
Yes, exactly. Perfectly tied back to exactly how the movie was. So it's almost like you're kind of like reliving the movie through music without actually watching it. That's what I loved about the tie-in between the movies and the soundtracks back then. Also, to bring it back to the movie from a personal perspective, when you're a 10-year-old boy, I mean, it doesn't really get any better than the holy trinity of Halle Berry, Robin Givens, and Layla Rashawn. I mean, it was, you want to talk about 3 absolutely gorgeous and sexy women, and you're 10 years old. My gosh. And even now, those women, 30 years later, still to this day, just absolutely stunning. Just as an aside, but the soundtrack.
No, I'm with you. I loved all of them, and I remember seeing Jacqueline, and we're not supposed to like Jacqueline, but as a young black woman, I still remember looking at her like she was in this place of power.
Absolutely.
She had power over him, and I remember being like, "Wow!" Like I liked her. You know, I looked up to her like, "Wow!" You know.
And then for some people, they guess that Jacqueline's persona is aspirational to some people because it really does show a woman being empowered and not necessarily beholden to a man's desires for her, to feel like she's the one in control. She's the one who is calling the shots, and what I say goes. And to Marcus, he had never seen anything like that before. So yeah, and to go back to the soundtrack, to me, even though I didn't see the movie, I mean, the soundtrack I always heard, because my sisters had that, and I had older sisters. They would buy things like this, and this was right in their wheelhouse, right in the alley of what they loved to listen to. It was R&B music. It was slow jams. It was New Jack Swing. It was a little bit of hip hop. It was Babyface and L.A. Reid. It was the music that they liked to produce, bringing on producers and acts that definitely fit the type of music that they wanted to do. They worked really, I think, with these artists, and the artists working with Babyface and L.A. to sort of craft this theme of the movie soundtrack that tied it back to the themes of what we were seeing in Boomerang. And I thought that was part of the genius of it. And when I watched The Art of Organized Noise, the documentary about the organized noise, Rico Wade, Sleepy Brown, and Ray Murray, who produced for Outkast and Goody Mob and the Dungeon Family, is that Sleepy went to go work with Babyface in L.A. Before they brought them on as a production team. He went to go work with them on this, and he said when he was in the studio recording with them that he messed around, stepped back, and then kicked out a plug out of the wall, and everything shut down. Everyone turned around and looked at him, and he said he was so nervous because it's Babyface there, it's Dallas there, it's LA there. People are looking at him like, what in the hell did you just do? Somebody get this boy up out of here. So, but I think that even though I liked R&B back then, but one of the things, even back then, I was a huge Boyz II Men fan. And so I still am a very big Boyz II Men fan. So there were songs on here that resonated with me, even at like 10 years old back then, and songs that even now, being 40 and 30 years later, listening to them like, yo, these songs are really, when we talk about the music of your life, this is part of the soundtrack and the music of your life. And while I was young back then, I definitely can appreciate the music that came out, because these are songs now, when you play them for a certain audience, you get a certain reaction from people because you just were, like you said, you get transported when you hear classic music back to those times when that music first came out, what you were thinking, what you were feeling, who you were with, what situation you were dealing with, all those things sort of coming flooding back to you back at that moment. So so the thing that I loved about that soundtrack is that it really kind of, I think it was synergistic with the movie. Perfect chemistry between telling the story through a movie and then telling the story through soundtrack. So definitely major props there.
Yeah, they definitely did a really good job choosing the tracks and also the score.
Yes.
You know, like I said, there are several songs that were featured in the movie that are not on the soundtrack, and they also were really well chosen for those scenes. When I see the scenes, I hear the song in my head too.
Yes.
So they did a really good job with that, putting that all together.
Yeah, and this was the era, like you mentioned it during the videos, that you would see the videos for these singles and you would see the clips of the movie interspersed throughout the videos, you know, and you would even have the intros of the videos where you would hear a clip, like you talked about Love Should Have Brought You Home, with that classic scene between Angela and Marcus when he comes home after having sex with Jacqueline again, and the fight that they had. So, yeah, it definitely brings you back to that, and that's the thing I loved about the era. I definitely loved that aspect of it.
Horizon Block Party is on. It's a free front row ticket to amazing VR experiences all summer long. Only in Horizon Worlds on MetaQuest 2. Post Malone kicks things off with a special VR performance of 12 Karat Toothache, followed by more of your favorite music, comedy, and sports. Strap on your MetaQuest 2. Download the free Horizon Worlds app and join the party. Follow us on Instagram at Horizon Worlds to learn more.
For the love of fall, Starbucks pumpkin spice lattes and pumpkin cream cold brews are back. Smooth espresso dashed with pumpkin pie spice and velvety whipped cream. Or cold brew topped with pumpkin cream cold foam fit for the season. Your pumpkin awaits. Order today in the Starbucks app.
Because I see it in my head. You know, what do you know about love? I'm sick and tired of men acting like they know what love is. I see it in my head.
Yes. Yes, no, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Highlights and lowlights.
So we're getting to your highlights, Charlie, of the Boomerang soundtrack. Just give us a few of your highlights and any lowlights if you have them.
So my highlights. Okay, so I have a lot of what I would say is probably the typical or the assumed highlights. End of the Road was a major song. I remember doing research on it, and it charted for a very long time. I believe it broke some records. That was a big one. End of the Road was a really big song. Same with Love Should Have Brought You Home last night. Mm-hmm. But I have two other highlights from the soundtrack. That one is a lesser known song and one was kind of popular. One of them is PM Dawn's I Die Without You. And I kind of have a little story that I want to share with that one. Or a personal anecdote with that one. So when this song came out, I mean, the movie, the soundtrack, everything was big. I had just had or was going through my first breakup. And I had mentioned this in my own podcast. Originally, I felt sensitive about the song because when we broke up, he was actually, my ex-boyfriend was leaving me for another girl. And so he left me for the other girl, but then he would call me up on the phone to cry about the problems they were having. It was a whole teenage dramatic thing. Yeah. And he told me that he would cry and listen to PM Dawn's I Die Without You. So that automatically made that song uncool in my book. So for the longest time, I would avoid the video, and if it came on the radio, I would cut it off because that reminded me of him crying over her. Yeah. But finally, I mean, the song was so pretty, and I remember seeing the movie, and then when they show it in the movie, it's such this beautiful moment. I think they had the skyline showing. It was a well done scene. Yeah. Finally, I was like, I gotta just give it up and just listen to the daggone song and admit that it's really a beautiful song. So it's like I had to push aside my own feelings so I could accept it in associations with the song, so I could accept it and listen to it again, because I had this bad association with it. For the longest time. I couldn't even listen to PM Dawn, but finally I had to let it go and had to listen to it, and I let it go. I was like, this is a beautiful song. I really like it. Forget him, forget her. They can cry, whatever. Yeah. That's definitely a highlight because it really is a gorgeous song. And I mean, from a hip hop group, it's not usual. They did something really, really different. Mm-hmm. My other highlight I have to add, because this one I don't think was an actual released single, but I remember when I saw the movie being like, oh, shucks. It is Feels Like Heaven. Mm-hmm. And who is singing this one?
This is that's by Kenny Vaughn.
This is Kenny Vaughn.
In The Art of Love, yeah.
In The Art of Love. So this was the scene, I believe, when Marcus and Jacqueline, I think they first had sex. Oh my goodness, I devoured that scene. Like, look, my eyes were big, jaw dropped. It just was so sexy and so cool, and it had this sort of quasi acapella sound. I was like, and I know a lot of people was like, oh, they love that song, and it was one of those songs that well after the movie was gone, I wish I knew what it was. I didn't actually own the soundtrack, and I couldn't find it. Back then, you couldn't. There was no internet, so you couldn't just find something on YouTube, or there's no Spotify. So like once it's over and you don't actually own it, it's over. And I didn't know what it was, but that really stood in my head. And when I saw that scene, I heard that song, I was like, ooh, I want to do what they doing. Like, that was a highlight for me because it was completely new. It wasn't on the radio. It was like one of those little hidden gems. I didn't know who this artist was. And even years later, when I think about the soundtrack, I think of Feels Like Heaven. Yeah. La la. I really like that one.
Cool.
Oh, is it my lowlights now, or?
Yeah, go ahead if you got them. Yep.
Okay. I hate sometimes to pull out the lowlights because I feel bad. 'Cause I feel like I'm disrespecting the soundtrack as a whole that I love. But if I have to choose, I'm gonna have to go with the two of them. 7 Day Weekend with Grace Jones. Well, for one, I didn't know it was Grace Jones for the longest time. In the movie, they only play a little snippet of it, and it's like a transition from one scene to another. That's fine. But when I actually try to sit down and listen to the whole song, it's not the type of song where I could listen to it again, or it's not memorable for me. So I think she might have had this song prior. I'm not sure though. Yeah. The other one I think is Tonight Is Right by Keith Washington. This one I think is played at the beginning of the movie. If I'm remembering correctly.
I think so, yeah.
Marcus was having Jacqueline over, so I remember he had a remote. for his stereo system, I think. And I remember that was like a big deal, having remote control for stuff. And you're like, ooh, he got the whole, and you can hear the speakers all over the place. I was probably more impressed by his apartment. But again, when I try to listen to the whole song through, it's not one that's as memorable with me. It was the little snippet they used in the movie was well done. But besides that, it's not one of the big ones that I think about when I think about the soundtrack.
Yeah.
So that would be it for me.
Well, cool. So, yeah, my highlights, the obvious ones, I mean, you know, to tell you about, you know, the ones that we all know. I mean, introduction with Toni on here, the duet that she had with Babyface with Give You My Heart, which is the opening track on the soundtrack. A really great song. This really, I think, this soundtrack and the beginning of this started a very long and prosperous relationship between Toni and Babyface. And, you know, this was a great duo. I think a good choice to open up the soundtrack with. Love Should Have Brought You Home. I mean, great. And the story behind that song that they gave, the fact that Babyface and LA wrote that song originally and they had Anita Baker in mind to be able to sing it.
That's right.
And Anita was pregnant, so she couldn't come record it. But because Toni is the one they got to record the demo for Anita to hear, and they asked her, well, who do you think should sing it? And she said, the girl you got on this singing there right now. Have her sing it, because Toni used to look up to Anita because stylistically their voices were very similar, you know, and so she looked up to Anita. And so when Anita said you should have the girl who sung the demo sing the song, well, then there you go. And these are one of the songs that, like I said, helped introduce us to Toni and eventually led us to a career that would get into full swing by the next year. A little bit about these next two songs, and one, I'll Die Without You by PM Dawn. It's just one of those songs that it's like one of those songs that you hear, and I still hear now, even when I'm on a Quiet Storm, when I'm on 96.3, and it's such a Quiet Storm song. And what I love about this is that this is a song that 30 plus years since it's been out, that this is songs now that I still hear dance to at weddings. And, you know, I see people make video tributes with this, but it's like you said, it really is a really beautiful song. And I know someone else who had a similar situation with your story with you and your boyfriend, how they had a similar, like, sort of the same type of feeling with this. They couldn't stand this song for the longest while. So it's funny when you mention that, because I was like, damn, I know somebody who had a similar story that song reminded them of someone that they can't stand anymore. But it really is funny. It really is a great song. It really is something, like you said, for a group like PM Dawn doing something different, something that is a song that probably one of their well-known or best 2 or 3 best-known songs out there. And then End of the Road. Like I mentioned to you, I'm a really big Boyz II Men fan. Like, I was one of the folks that, you know, I used to, you know, props to Jodeci, but back then, you know, it was sort of like, you know, you had people back then were like in camps. Like, you had, you were a fan of Boyz II Men, or you were a fan of Jodeci. Yeah. And I felt a lot of people were fans of Jodeci, obviously, for obvious reasons. But to me, I always respected the talent, and especially the quality of music that Boyz II Men had, because I thought vocally they were superior to damn near everybody, you know? Yeah. But End of the Road was such a huge song. Like, I just remember during that summer when this soundtrack comes out and this movie comes out, one, I remember hearing the song so much on the radio. Yep. And then 2, I remember seeing this video on BET or VH1 or like all the time being played over and over again. And so it was a huge, as a matter of fact, the song End of the Road actually broke a record, which was Elvis's record for the consecutive weeks on spending #1 on the U.S. Billboard Hot 100. And the record stood a whole few months, because then later on it was broken by Whitney Houston's I Will Always Love You later on that year from the Bodyguard soundtrack. But this song is epic. When you talk about the best songs from a group like the caliber of Boyz II Men, if you're doing a concert for Boyz II Men, 9 times out of 10, if they're closing out, this is probably a song they're going to close with. And that says something considering the hits that they have. And they got tons and tons of hit. This song is actually the song that served as the theme and the closing song for my senior prom. So, you know, and so what I remember is after this song is being played, everybody in our class is singing that hook. No.
That's sweet for graduation.
End of the road.
Y'all do the slow claps.
Yes. On the
let go.
It's so natural. Like, we did that. We had people.
I belong to you.
Like, yo, we did all of that. And so,
that's sweet.
So this song holds a special place in my heart for that reason. But in particular, the song itself was wildly successful.
Yes.
And when you talk about, like, hey, you're putting together hits for Boyz II Men, if they're putting together a show, this is a concert closer right here. So, so those highlights, obviously the obvious ones. But then something else I wanted to sort of point to, the song with Aaron Hall and Charlie Wilson, It's Gonna Be All Right. Now, this is a little bit more uptowns, more New Jack swing.
It is.
And then Aaron Hall, is, off of his career with Guy. He had been together with Guy. I know a lot of people like to talk about, the comparisons between Aaron Hall and R. Kelly, how stylistically they're similar. But Aaron mentioned this in the track, how he said he called Charlie his mentor. And when you think about their vocal styles, they actually are very similar to each other. Aaron has a lot of the same vocal stylings that Charlie has. And so when you're listening to it, it's just like, to me, I'm like, oh, is that Aaron? Is that Charlie? And it's like, is that Aaron? Is that Charlie? But I thought it was really cool to be able to hear the two of them together on a track. A little bit more up-tempo for my liking, but it was cool. I didn't really have a big problem with it. Another song by Johnny Gill. Shout out to Johnny Gill, DC native, with There You Go. One thing that Johnny can do is a slow jam. He can do a slow song.
Yes, he can.
And it was perfect for this soundtrack. Hot Sex on a Platter by Tribe Called Quest. I was a huge Tribe fan back then, and this is right after the Low End Theory and then them getting ready to release the next year, Midnight Marauders, which to me is one of my favorite hip-hop albums of all time. But for the most part, though, I mean, I don't really have a lot of lowlights, but I do have to agree with you on your lowlights. I was not a fan of 7 Day Weekend by Grace Jones. Okay. I'm not really a big dance music fan, So, like, I mean, when I listened to it, it was just kind of like, I need to skip this, Yeah. So, and then, I do have to agree with you as well with Keith Washington, because it's just like, I mean, you got Johnny Gill on here. You have Babyface singing already. It's like, why? You don't really need this here. Like, this is like, we don't need this. It's like, you look inside the grocery cart, somebody put something in the grocery cart. It's like, okay, do we need this or do we not need this? Do we really need this? No. Put it back on the shelf, And that's what they should have done with this, I think, just in my mind. I mean, it's, I could have done without it. Those two songs I could have done without. But other than that, I mean, no really a big problem with Shanice's. And Shanice will be big later on this year with I Love Your Smile. And so, she was starting to launch as well. I got to agree with you there on Feels Like Heaven with Kenny Vaughn and The Art of Love, that perfectly placed in the movie. The song just, it's a really, really cool song. So those are my highlights and my lowlights. One of the things that I think that's great about this soundtrack is, like I said, you talk about the titles of the song, how they sort of correlate that, the reversal of the dog with your group TLC, with Toni, with Damian Dame, and with Highland Place Mobsters. So we're talking about, hey, the reversal, it's sort of like we talked about the Boomerang effect. Basically, Marcus getting done to him what was he always did to women. So, it really is just perfect, the reason how it just correlates with it and correlates back to the movie.
Final verdict.
So, Charlie, what say you about Boomerang, the soundtrack? Now, we've talked about the movie, how it correlates back to it, but now 30 years later, you had a chance to listen to it, digest it. You've watched the movie a couple of years back, listened to the soundtrack. You've done something about it already. So just give us your feelings as far as a rating for this soundtrack. Is it a certified classic, borderline classic just in its time, or not a classic at all? And then, of course, that rating from 7 to 10. 7, you don't feel as strongly about it, and 10, you feel very strongly about it.
So I had to think about this one because, my little 90s brain wants to be like, this is a classic, this is the greatest thing, blah, blah, blah. But I decided to call it a classic in its time, mainly because it definitely is somewhat of a classic. It had some major, huge hits that stayed in the culture for a long time with Toni Braxton and Boyz II Men and even PM Dawn. I decided to call it a classic of its time because when I was revisiting it this morning, listening to it, it is very much a 90s album. And there's certain songs, for instance, Reversal of the Dog, or even Give You My Heart, or there's a couple other ones where you clearly know this is New Jack City in its 90s, and that's great, but it's not something that you would hear today.
Yeah.
Also, while it was really, really big, I do tend to feel like it is a often forgotten about album. When I did my episode about it, I was promoting it, I had a couple of people tell me, wow, they loved it so much when it came up, they forgot all about it. I think that, along with the movie, I think a lot of people have just forgotten about it. I don't think it's something that the next generation and the newer generation out right now is really well aware of it. It's like you kind of had to be there. It was major in the early 90s, the movie and the soundtrack. But I think that a lot of people have kind of slept on it. I think it's an underrated thing. So I think it was much bigger then. But I think when you talk to people and you ask people what were some of the best soundtracks, I think a lot of people forget about it. Me, it was always like tops, maybe even number one. Definitely top 5. But I think a lot of people have forgotten about it. So I've decided, you know what, in the 90s, major classic. Today, I think it's a little forgotten about.
Yeah.
Or maybe a lot forgotten about.
I feel like I feel like we kind of had the same notes, because I have to agree with you that this is a classic in its time. I do think, and I talk a lot about this with my co-host J.O., how we talk about how sometimes music sounds dated. Now, that New Jack Swing is great when you're having throwback parties, when you're back in the 90s, but sometimes some of that stuff just sounds a little too dated, so it's just like it's a little too old school, and I know that may sound bad considering what this podcast is about, but sometimes this stuff is just like I think it was cool for back then, but now I don't know if this is too popping even right now. What's some New Jack Swing stuff you can play and it'd be like, yo, this is still the jam. Some stuff though you'd be like, I don't know about this.
It's true. I mean, to me, when I think of a classic, I think of something, if you're in a party and somebody puts it on now, everybody can be like, hey, you know. I don't see a lot of these songs, if you were to play them now, I think a lot of people might be a little lost, a little, it may not. To answer the second question was how strongly I felt about it. I think I was in the 7, 8 where I feel good about it, but I had some reservations. I had some reservations because I do think Love Should Have Brought You Home and End of the Road are classic.
Yes.
I think those songs are classic. I could hear those on the radio today. People would still love them. But the rest of the soundtrack, I feel like, is not as well known, particularly to newer generations. And that's why I said, we'll put it back in the 90s. And like I said, I feel bad saying it. So, I feel good, but I do have reservations. I think some parts of it could be classic, but other parts are very dated. And then, of course, you have your filler songs that not everybody's going to love. But underrated, often forgotten about soundtrack, I think.
Underrated, often forgot about soundtrack, Classic in its time for me as well. I feel as though, like you said, I agree with you. Love Should Have Brought You Home and End of the Road. I Die Without You in there as classic tracks. I think those are songs that will be timeless. I do think when you get into some of the other album tracks, not the non-singles, they don't really match up with the height of these classic songs that you have on there. And it's not really even close, to tell you the truth. I mean, so, and that's really, unfortunate considering the potential that this soundtrack had. Now, again, great job with tying in the themes from the movie into the titles and the themes of these songs. But I do have to say, though, when you talk about soundtracks in the 90s, like this is sort of like something that's kind of middle of the road, because there were some great soundtracks that were released by great movies in the 90s. And so with this one, like you said, I think people will forget a little bit about some of these, because then they'll reference, End of the Road, no doubt. Love Should Have Brought You Home, no doubt. Like Hot Sex, no doubt. Even sometimes PM Dawn, no doubt. And then everything else is just kind of like, I remember that. But it's just sort of like somebody has to remind you. You know, and with classics, nobody has to remind anybody. Right. So again, I think it was big back then. But I think as time has gone on, the movie itself, Boomerang, while I think people remember a lot of the scenes, I think though the 90s though were chock of a lot of cult classics and a lot of soundtracks that were just as classic as well, and that had the potential of really being groundbreaking. So then when you kind of get back in 30 years later, it's like, once you mentioned the movie and the soundtrack, like you said, a little bit underrated by some people, and something that like you have to remind them to be like, of this soundtrack, that was pretty cool. It had, it had End of the Road on there. It had Love Should Have Brought You Home. I thought it was great because it introduced the likes of Toni, and what Toni would do, I would say over the next 3 to 4 years was completely amazing. And so this was great for that respect. But I do have to say classic just in its time. I will say as well, an 8 on that matter as well. So,
wow.
Yeah. So I would say an 8 for just classic in its time. But I do think a few classic tracks on here, but the rest of the tracks on here don't really rise to the level of those classics. And sort of, will they complement them well? I mean, I guess, but you know, again, it's just something that I think that back then was hot, but nowadays, you know, might not be as hot. So, but that's the nature of it though.
Yeah, I think that of the songs that weren't as hot, the way they used them in the movie was cool. Some of these, like I said, were just 5-10 seconds used in the scene. That was great. But then to include them completely in the soundtrack, the whole song is not something that you really need to listen to.
Right,
And they're using the movie great for a soundtrack. You know, not so much. Now, I do have to mention one more song that I meant to mention before, but before we go, it was a song that was not on the soundtrack. I'm sorry, y'all. But when I saw it in the movie, I fell so in love with it, and I wanted to know what it was, and for years I couldn't find what it was, and it wasn't until a couple years ago that I figured out what it was. There was a scene where, and I mentioned this on my own episode, I'm sorry if I may seem repetitive, but there's a scene where they go to, I think it was New Orleans on a business trip, Marcus and Jacqueline.
Jacqueline and Marcus,
and they're in a club dancing, and the song is actually called I Feel Like Funkin' It Up by the Rebirth Brass Band.
Rebirth Brass Band, yep.
They are more popular now because of a TV show, I think it was called Treme.
Yeah,
and that song might have been used as the theme song. I remember that scene, and you see them like boot up, everybody's dancing, everybody's just kind of got this bop, and it's this dun, 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 dun. And I remember thinking, what is that? I loved that song, but it was never included on the soundtrack. So for years, I never knew what that song was, and I couldn't find it because, again, this is before the internet. And it wasn't until some 5 or 6 years ago I saw it on TV. I was like, oh my God, that's the song. I figured out what it was. But the fact that they chose that for that scene, and this was, you know, 30 years ago. So genius, because it introduced me to that. Sadly, it took me that long to figure out what it was. I wish it was on the soundtrack, so I would have known what it was. Because it's, when I hear it, it's so genius. I don't know what you call it. It's New Orleans jazz, I guess.
Yeah, Rebirth Brass Band is a huge group. Matter of fact, there's a few people that I know that love them. That song that you mentioned, that was the theme of Treme. Treme, of course, being another one of David Simon's shows. David Simon from The Wire, who created The Wire, and also Life, Homicide on the Streets. Rebirth Brass Band, they really call it funky brass. I know people who like them, Trombone Shorty. So, you know, though that type of music is really like, you know, people jam with Rebirth Brass Band and with Trombone Shorty. So, yeah.
And I'd never heard of that or that sound, but that, I remember leaving the theater like, what? Like, I wanted to know what it was, but I could not figure out what it was. I'm sad that they did not include that on the soundtrack, because that would definitely have been a highlight, but it really stuck with me. So the score and the soundtrack did introduce me to some new stuff, and that is something that I really love. Of if I walk away from any movie, introducing me to something new, then I'm like, ooh, wow, you know, what was that? But I definitely would have been remiss if I didn't mention that.
Good catch. That's definitely, I remember, that's something that I definitely remember as well. But for some reason, just, you know, I don't know whether I just glossed over it, but good catch there, Rebirth Brass Band. I feel like funky, the theme to Treme, which was on HBO for a few years afterwards. So very good catch. And I don't know if you know this, Charlie, but you know, Boomerang actually was recreated as a series on BET. They created it. Yeah, they did. It's, you know, it was supposed to be like a reimagining. It's more so not really comedic. It's more so drama, I guess you could say. It was renewed for a second season, but then
this is recent.
Yeah, but they only came on for 2 seasons. It was not renewed for a third season. But it came on BET. I'm pretty sure you could probably find some of the reruns on there, but it was basically sort of based around, I guess, the same premise. But you know, it was less like romantic comedy and more romantic drama. So,
interesting.
You know, So
somebody else was thinking about it besides just us.
Yeah, well, it was produced by, I believe the TV was produced by Lena Waithe, and also Halle Berry was an executive producer on it as well. So
get out.
Yeah.
I'm so late.
It was. Well, don't worry. Hey, listen, I caught on to it late as well, and I didn't know that it actually wasn't renewed for a third season, but it kind of makes sense. I can understand that though. But yeah. all based on the movie Boomerang soundtrack. Make sure y'all go check it out. 30 years old this week. Make sure y'all go watch the movie if you haven't watched it yet. It is a great watch though, and if you're into classic black cinema from the last few years, 30 to 40 years, make sure y'all go check that joint out, man, and let us know what you think about it. Hit us up on social media and let us know what you think about the soundtrack, or you think we're on point, or you think we might be hating a little bit. I don't know. Go ahead and let us know. We'd be glad to hear what it is you want to say about it. But always, we want to make sure that we give props to our homegirl, Charlee D from Word to the Mother podcast for joining us once again. Charlee, thank you so much. This was a blast. I said before we started, I was like, I don't think we're going to make it as long as we did the last time. And yet, again, here we are. But you know, time flies when you're having fun, and it's always a blast sitting here talking with you. Now, before you get up out of here, let everybody know where they can find you on social media. I know that you've been taking a little bit of a break now, but folks can still go and check out your back catalog and check you out on social media. So let people know where they can find you.
Just look for Word to the Mother spelled Mutha. I'm on Podbean, IG, Twitter, and Facebook, and keep you up to date on new episodes. I did do an episode on Boomerang, as well as Toni Braxton and Boyz II Men, and it's been so much fun. If you're a lover of 90s music, you definitely have to check it out. So jump on social media. I'm there.
There you go. And if you're a fan of the Vault Classic Music Reviews podcast, you're definitely going to dig Word to the Mother podcast. I mean, it is really informational. There are things that Charlee says on those pods, things that I don't even know. And so I end up learning a lot of things from her. And I love the format of her show. Not only does she highlight artists, she also highlights songs as well. So some of the songs on there, it definitely will give you a touch of nostalgia. So once again, Word to the Mother podcast, Charlee D. Charlee, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to have you back again soon.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. Always a pleasure. So much fun.
All right. And there you have it. None other than Charlee D of the Word to the Mother podcast. Make sure y'all go check out her podcast as well. Anywhere where you can find podcasts. Go listen to it. Follow her on social media. Again, she has a dope platform and has a great show with great topics. And of course, if you love this show, like I said before, I'm pretty sure you'll dig her podcast too. So make sure y'all go follow her, check her out, and support her show. And that's going to wrap up yet another edition of The Vault. Please make sure you are checking us out on our host on Red Circle. You can also visit us at vaultclassicpod.com. That's vaultclassicpod.com. You can go there, listen to the back catalog, leave us a review. In the bottom right-hand corner with the microphone shaded in blue, you can leave us a voice note. Go ahead, click on that microphone to record one. Show us some love. Let us know what you think about the show. In the bottom left-hand corner with the coffee cup shaded in yellow, that's our Buy Me a Coffee page. You can go there to click on it and leave a small monetary donation to make sure we can continue keeping the vault open for years to come. Any little bit helps. We definitely appreciate it. You can also reach us on social media at Vault Classic Pod on Instagram, at Vault Classic on Twitter, and on Facebook and YouTube, you can reach us at the Vault Classic Music Reviews Podcast. Like the Facebook page, subscribe to the YouTube channel, interact with us on social media. We do it here all for you. We appreciate the support, and if you have a friend, tell a friend, and make sure that that friend tells a friend. Always remember to keep your headphones on and your music loud, but not too loud. And as we close, we'd like to remind everyone to dream big, because dreams are the basis for creation. Always create, motivate, and elevate, because you were never destined or created to stay stationary in this life. And on that note, we say peace.
Thank you for listening and coming into The Vault. Please subscribe and visit us at vaultclassicpod.com. That's vaultclassicpod.com.